Jens Stoltenberg, NATO's outgoing Secretary General, held his farewell press conference marking the end of his decade-long tenure with a dramatic message. As he prepares to step down, Stoltenberg made one final attempt to stir geopolitical tensions, addressing sensitive issues such as missile strikes on Russia, Ukraine's potential NATO membership, and the ongoing confrontation with China. In his remarks, he not only embraced a hawkish stance, but also seemed to push for the kind of escalation that could ignite a broader, more dangerous conflict. This begs the question, why does Europe continue to tolerate figures like Stoltenberg who flirt with the spectre of a Third World War? With only 10 days left in office, Stoltenberg's closing remarks were as charged as they were ironic. In a tone reminiscent of a dark joke, he delivered what he framed as good and bad news to the North Atlantic Alliance. The good news, according to him, was that NATO had fulfilled a decade-old promise to increase national defense spending across member states to 2% of their GDP. This goal, while aggressively pushed by former US President Donald Trump, was conveniently claimed by Stoltenberg as his own success, a move as brazen as it is shameless. But the real audacity of Stoltenberg's farewell came with the so-called bad news. Despite meeting this financial target, he warned, it is still not enough to ensure NATO's security. Here, Stoltenberg's rhetoric reached new heights of absurdity, likening himself to a con artist who endlessly demands more money while delivering increasingly dismal results. Over the past decade, NATO's budget has doubled, and while member nations are now spending tens of billions more on defense, Europe is arguably less secure than at any point in recent history. Only 23 out of NATO's 32 member nations have managed to meet the 2% GDP defense spending target. For many, the financial burden has been enormous, with significant portions of these funds funneled under Stoltenberg's leadership as the alliance's budget swelled dramatically, and yet Stoltenberg stood before the world declaring that it was still not enough. His solution? More money, more weapons, and fewer restrictions. If Stoltenberg's mission over the past decade was truly to bolster European security, then by any reasonable measure he has failed. Europe today is more unstable and unpredictable than ever, with conflict in Ukraine, fears of wider wars, and constant speculation about the possibility of a Third World War. Far from deterring danger, Stoltenberg's policies have provoked it. His relentless push to contain Russia has instead inflamed tensions, drawing Europe closer to the edge of chaos. In one final reckless move, Stoltenberg doubled down on his warmongering agenda, urging NATO to remove all remaining restrictions on long-range missiles being supplied to Ukraine by Western powers, such as the US, UK, and France. This call is not just a farewell gesture, it is a provocative invitation to escalate the very conflict that threatens to engulf Europe in a wider war. Jens Stoltenberg, in his final days as NATO Secretary General, has made it clear that the alliance has no reason to fear Russia's so-called red lines. Yet paradoxically, if there's truly nothing to fear, it becomes increasingly difficult to justify the astronomical sums being poured into NATO's military machine. With a bloated defense budget, one might question whether the organization is defending Europe or merely fueling an unnecessary arms race under the guise of security. Stoltenberg continues to insist that NATO's open-door policy for Ukraine remains intact, speaking of an unprecedented closeness between Kyiv and the alliance. But beneath this rhetoric lies the uncomfortable reality. The very process of drawing Ukraine into NATO's orbit is what sparked the largest military conflict on European soil since World War II. Stoltenberg's refusal to acknowledge this connection speaks volumes about the disconnect between his words and the consequences of NATO's actions. As if the confrontation with Russia weren't enough, Stoltenberg has now set his sights on China, sounding alarms over supposed threats from Beijing. At his farewell press conference, he once again stoked fears of a new conflict, this time with a rising China. But a clash with China is precisely what Europe cannot afford, especially as it is already mired in a costly and dangerous confrontation with Russia. Yet Stoltenberg appears undeterred, seemingly urging the West to antagonize both the Russian bear and the Chinese dragon in tandem. This aggressive posture is no accident. Stoltenberg, far from being a rogue hawk, has fulfilled his true mission diligently if one understands his role as increasing Europe's dependence on the United States and pitting Brussels against Washington's strategic rivals, Moscow and Beijing. This lens explains many of the contradictions in Stoltenberg's actions. Although he is supposedly tasked with ensuring European security, his policies have created new and more severe threats to the continent, all while reinforcing Europe's subordination to US geopolitical interests. Perhaps nothing illustrates this dynamic more clearly than Stoltenberg's fierce opposition to the creation of a European Union rapid response force. He has argued that such an initiative would weaken NATO, but the reality is simpler. A more autonomous European military would reduce the EU's dependence on the US. This, of course, would contradict Stoltenberg's underlying mission, which can be summarized as follows: deplete European arsenals by sending them to Ukraine and hand control of these resources to the Pentagon. Stoltenberg's forthcoming career move offers further insight into his role in shaping Europe's military landscape. After stepping down from NATO on October 1st, passing the baton to former Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte, he is widely expected to assume leadership of the Munich Security Conference. This transition is noteworthy for several reasons, not least of which is the conference's symbolic significance. It was at this very forum in 2007 that Russian President Vladimir Putin delivered his now famous speech, warning the West, particularly the US and NATO, to reconsider their course, lest they provoke the very dangers that we now face. Stoltenberg's appointment to head the Munich Security Conference is also significant because, since its inception in 1963, the Forum has been a primarily German institution, meant to address European security concerns and prevent a Third World War. The fact that Stoltenberg, not a German but a Norwegian, closely aligned with US interests, will now helm this critical event suggests a deeper alignment of European security policies with American strategic imperatives. The relocation of Norwegian NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg to Munich marks more than just the end of discussions about alternatives to confronting Russia. It signifies the culmination of a broader process, the dismantling of Germany's military political sovereignty, even at the level of a once vital discussion forum. Stoltenberg's appointment to head the Munich Security Conference seems to symbolize the closing chapter in Germany's struggle for autonomy, as the country drifts ever closer to the orbit of Washington's strategic interests. Among the US's long-standing goals has been the erosion of German-Russian economic cooperation and the weakening of both powers. The special military operation in Ukraine, coupled with what could be described as a parallel American political maneuver, has succeeded in driving a wedge between Berlin and Moscow. Germany now finds itself reliant on American energy supplies, its once competitive industrial base weakened and its military capabilities gutted. There was a time when Germany, in its zeal to support Ukraine, left itself vulnerable, sending air defense systems meant for its own security to Kiev. Stoltenberg played a key role in facilitating this transformation. His advocacy for greater NATO involvement and the redirection of European defense resources to the Ukrainian front have contributed to Germany's current plight. And yet, instead of being criticized for these outcomes, Stoltenberg has been rewarded once again, this time with a prestigious role in Germany's security architecture. His new position might as well be called US Military Governor General in Germany, but the formal title wouldn't fit into the administrative structures that currently govern Europe. Still, the symbolism is clear. Germany has handed another significant piece of its sovereignty to a man whose tenure as NATO chief has deepened the continent's dependence on the US and exacerbated its entanglements in global conflicts. Stoltenberg's career trajectory reflects the power of money, status, and US backing to mold even those who once opposed NATO and American militarism into fervent globalists. Once a Norwegian politician who decried the very forces he now champions, Stoltenberg has transformed into the most dangerous type of hawk, the kind willing to flirt with the spectre of nuclear war. His rise is a chilling reminder of how power can reshape convictions, turning former critics into instruments of the very machine they once fought against. But this is far from an isolated or paradoxical case. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz followed a similar path, and there are countless other examples across Europe. To ascend within the European political elite, loyalty to Washington seems not just encouraged, but required. Many have taken this oath of allegiance, positioning themselves as reliable allies of the US and its strategic aims. What is particularly striking about Stoltenberg, however, is how conspicuously he has shed both fear and conscience along the way. His hawkishness, once unthinkable, now defines his legacy. How and why this transformation occurred is a question for historians to unravel. One can only hope that future scholars will study Stoltenberg's role in the Second Cold War, rather than analyzing him as a key figure in the events leading up to a nuclear catastrophe.